Welcome back to the Wingspan Podcast, episode 38. I'm Doug Barak, joined by my co-host Chris Mahala, Nets Daily, and our special guest. He covers the Brooklyn Nets for the New York Post.
Welcome, Brian Lewis, to the podcast. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join Doug and I. How are you doing?
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me. Doing all
Glad
right.
to have you on. So before we discuss the Nets, can you talk about your journey to New York Post, what college you go to, and your first media position or internship?
Oh, goodness. Well, that's a while ago, so you're digging way back. But I went to Rutgers. I had a very short, ill-fated track career there. Tore up my hamstring at the time trials for the Melrose Games, so I was rehabbing. And as an English major, I was traveling with the team, and they never wrote about us on the school paper because it's track. So I asked the school paper, I believe it might have been Tara Sullivan, at the time might have been the sports editor. I said, hey, you want me to write up something about the team while I'm doing my rehab? And they said, sure, why not? I never really made it back all the way, but I just kind of fell into the sports writing thing. I'm ready to graduate, and I'm ready to try to go on to law school, and I realized I had no money, not even enough to apply for law schools. So I had to go out and get a square job, and I kind of fell into sports writing and fell in love with it. So I became a sports writer. And after about 8 years of that, I ended up at the Post. And I've been there 22 years.
It's pretty impressive. That's awesome.
That's impressive. And then, Brian, with the season coming up and everything, is there anything you do personally that you prepare for, right? So obviously, it takes that rust off, going into game one, whatever the case is. So talk to me. Is there any type of things you do to get into that full swing, or is it more of, okay, let me just get there and do it?
It was a little different before I got put on the beat, because before I got put on the beat, I spent, 15 years as a GA. So I went from one season to another. There really wasn't an off season for me. I would finish the World Series and then go drop straight into football. And then football would take me into December/January, and that would drop me into basketball. And then after the Final Four, I would fly from the Final Four, maybe have a day, and then it'd be opening day. And so I didn't have an off season.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a little different. Once I got put on the beat, I got into a whole different cycle where I basically would go straight from the U.S. Open, the U.S. Open tennis, not golf, basically from there into training camp, almost couple weeks. Now with COVID, it's a whole different world. Our patterns are messed up. I suppose now what I do is just simply watch games, and I've watched a couple old games. Not necessarily that I'm trying to get trends, because you're talking about different coaching staff. But just watching the old game, a better feel of watching the players and thinking about leads in your head. How would I write this game differently than how I wrote it? How could I improve on that? What did I miss that I shouldn't have last time? How can I be observant? So it's a little bit more of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no, definitely. And was there anything you've seen thus far from your findings that you can relate to this upcoming season?
Well, I suppose not necessarily to be flippant or wish any ill will on anybody. I guess it's more my antenna would always be up when guys leave the court. And it's a little different because when you're there in person and guys leave the court, you can usually keep an eye on, okay, are they leaving the court to get on a treadmill and warm up? Or are they leaving the court to go in the back? I suppose it's, when you look at the Nets' recent injury history, unfortunately, no detail can be too small. Because the tiniest things, unfortunately, we've seen turn into medium-sized things or big things. Um, so I suppose it's just being vigilant and keeping an eye on that, and always digging down if you can. Again, if you're in person, if you can find that guy after the game, even if they've come back into games. Because usually there's this image, if they come back in the game, they're okay. They played the last 5 minutes, or they played the last 7 minutes. And we've seen in cases like with Karis LeVert or other guys, they might come back and play, and they're really not okay. So I suppose offhand that might be one.
Yeah, fair enough. So switching gears a little bit. So how do you feel about the coaching staff and the roster makeup? There's a lot of new names, decent amount of new faces. So what are your thoughts thus far?
Well, I mean, it's certainly overwhelmingly, it's not only the most talented roster, obviously, since I've been on the beat, and the most talented roster since they've been in Brooklyn. Uh, it's easy to see why this is probably the most anticipated season in Nets history. As far as the coaching staff, a lot has been made about Steve being a rookie coach. I mean, rookie coach, not even having been an assistant coach, a rookie coach in almost every way. But having talked to him, it's easy to see why he was so attractive to them to hire, above and beyond his past relationship with Sean. Above and beyond that, he is both well-spoken and eloquent, but he's also exceptionally positive and a good communicator and a good connector of people. And I think they felt, meaning Sean and to an extent Joe Tsai, felt that that's what they needed. And that's clearly his strength. That's what he is. He's a good communicator. And he obviously has an ability to build positive relationships one-on-one with people. And that's something that they felt they needed. Even more so than an X's and O's guy. Because he has a pretty experienced coaching staff. Jacques been a head coach, and Mike D'Antoni's been a successful head coach for a long time. So I think they felt they have that side covered, and now they were looking to sort out the other side, which was somebody that could talk to the stars and talk to the journeymen and talk to the developmental players and be able to communicate and vibe with all three of those guys.
Yeah, speaking of Jacques and MDA, like, what do you think about the idea of having coordinators in basketball? It's more of a common theme in football, but in basketball, I don't think those terminology are thrown around as much.
It's not thrown, well, certainly not thrown around as much as it is in football, because in football, I mean, it's mandatory and has been mandatory for generations, going all the way down to the high school level. JV, I mean, you got, offensive coordinators. So it's probably not as common to the fan to hear it, but the NBA is definitely going more in that direction. And I think in this case, I mean, it's certainly necessary. It's necessary to have an offensive coordinator, and it's going to be very necessary to have a defensive coordinator or two, because that's the side of the court where ultimately you're going to decide, is this team just a decent team that gets by on talent and beats up on bad teams, or is this team actually a contender? Because if you look on the defensive end, top three teams in defense have the top three records in the league. That's not a coincidence. So they were 10th last year. We'll see. That's a whole different coaching staff and a whole different scheme and halfway a different roster. So we'll see. Are they a top 10 defense? Are they a top 5 defense? Or are they struggling sitting there at 13 and having to try to outscore everybody?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think it's hard to gauge just through practice because they're top 5 and even through 7, playing against each other in skirmishes. Of course, the defense is going to look bad, and it's going to be a struggle until there's some real action. So hopefully with Sunday, we'll see some changes in that. And you did bring up a good point, because the Nets do technically have 2 defensive-minded assistant coaches. So one last thing on that, would you say that is, in fact, collaborative coaching, whether or not, the Kyrie quote that everyone goes crazy about? But honestly, that's what it is,
Yes.
And I think clearly, even before the whole Nash thing happened, or fully filled out his bench, that's what it's looking like. Would you feel like you pretty much agree with that? At least for the Nets, this is a great example of collaborative coaching based on coordinators and all that kind of mediums.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt it will be collaborative coaching. And that's one thing that has struck me about Nash. He is humble enough, despite being a Hall of Famer, to know what he doesn't know. Now, a lot of guys will say something in the media to try to manage the message, right? That's expected. So, if KD says, I'm not thinking about James Harden, he's not on my team, or if Karis LeVert is saying, yeah, whether he goes to practice or not, it's got nothing to do with us, you have to say things to manage the message. But maybe I'm naive, but in Nash's case, I really buy it when he says, yeah, I'm not offended by this. I mean, this is what he said. I read the context. I heard it. Yeah, he's saying it's collaborative coaching. I'm not offended by that. And he's gone out of his way to say himself that this is going to be collaborative coaching, and that's what he wants because he's a rookie and he needs that. And he knows what he doesn't know. When he says that stuff, I actually believe him. I actually buy it. Maybe I'm naive, but I actually buy it.
Yeah, I mean, it's too soon to fully judge, but I'm in the same boat with you. They've, the keywords are really, it's not like they practiced this mantra in such a short period of time. So I do agree with you on that. So from media weekend training camp thus far, what are some things that's really stood out to you?
Well, I'd say just reading between the lines, it really does seem like they're very comfortable with this roster that they have. They have an opportunity to try to pry James Harden out of Houston, but this roster that they have, they're confident in this roster and its depth and its versatility and how hard those guys are going to work together. You can work, but that's different from working to work together. And they're confident that the latter is going to get done. So they seem, granted, they're sending a message, obviously, down to Houston that we're going to do anything on our terms. But they do seem pretty confident going into the regular season that this is the squad that they're going to go and fight with.
So I agree with that. And then, Brian, to just switch gears a little bit, one word that me and you and the rest of the media have heard throughout the whole training camp is versatility, right? That's kind of like that one word that everyone keeps hearing. So what do you think about the Nets looking past that 1 through 5 dynamic due to that depth and versatility? Just what's your overall thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, they're a lot more versatile than they were. I mean, just look at the center position. You had, all right, there are some subtle differences between Jared and DeAndre as players, but they are still both traditional fives. Yeah, one guy's more mobile. One guy has shown the ability to protect the rim at this stage in his career better, but they're still traditional fives. What they had an issue with was guarding modern fives. They had an issue having to be able to switch out on the perimeter. They had an issue with a five that could pop. Now you've got guys like Jeff Green, hopefully maybe someday Reggie. You have guys that are more switchable out there. You have guys that can maybe space the floor a little bit better. And obviously their backcourt. We know that their backcourt is a little bit more versatile. But they needed to add some stoutness on the wing defensively. And I think Bruce can provide that. That's a guy that you can stick on an elite scorer and not have to ask Kyrie to do it, not have to ask Spencer to do that for 30 minutes or 33 minutes or 35 minutes. So they are more versatile than they've been. And those are the kind of things that help you get through a long season.
Agree with you. And then the money question, I guess you could say. How do you think Kevin Durant will look?
I mean, if he's himself saying, listen, I've got to play in an NBA game to know how I'm going to look, then I have to take his word on it. What I would say is this. In the offseason, I talked to several doctors that are specialists in the field, and they said, listen, given the time frame that he's had to recover, he's not rushing back. You're not trying to do this in 9 months. You're not doing this in 8 months. You're doing this in more 18 months. That with modern medicine, he should be essentially as good as he was before. Okay, that was fine. I took their word on it. But then when you hear it coming from players, because you can be physically fine, but not mentally fine, when I hear it from players like Gilbert Arenas and John Wall, Spencer, and now that they're in camp, all of the players are raving about how he looks. Okay, now I expect he will not only be physically fine and physically recovered, but that he can actually play the game at the same level. He won't be afraid of things. He won't be favoring things. So what I'd say is I would expect he won't play anywhere close to 72 games or 35 minutes a game just because I expect them to treat him with kid gloves. I expect them to rest him a lot during games. I expect them to probably be very cautious or tentative with the notion of back-to-backs. I expect that they will basically put him in bubble wrap at every opportunity. So his numbers may not look the same, but I do expect him to be an elite off force that's unguardable. I still expect that. Yeah, maybe the total numbers, the aggregate numbers, the counting numbers won't look as good, but when you see him on the court come playoff time, I still expect him to be about as potent as he was.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one thing that Nets fans have been saying for a long time is the Nets never really had the biggest weakness was power forward, but it seems like KD is that role. So were you surprised by that?
Was I surprised by what?
That KD would be the Nets four, not a
Oh,
three.
no. What? Maybe I was living in my own bubble. I always saw him like from when we were talking in June, or can they pull this off and can they get him? I always assumed that he would be a four. I never even thought that he could be a three. So I guess I was probably surprised that so many people were saying, "Yeah, we got this great small forward, but we still need a power forward." I'm like, "Well, you have the best power forward around. That's what he is." I mean, offensively, as Nash pointed out, he can really play where, but defensively, he'll guard unless there's some glaring reason. Uh, so yeah, I'm always this.
Yeah, no, that makes plenty of sense. He's such a versatile player, and that's what the theme of the offense and team is. So,
And then, Brian, I got to ask you, how many? Just predicting, right? Everyone's been kind of asking about it. KD stretch five, all that. How many minutes do you expect Kevin Durant to even see at the five, or how do you think they'll experiment with that? Kevin Durant, when he was
Yeah.
talking, I believe it was yesterday, he said, "Hey, they're just gonna throw me out there. I'm gonna see how my body reacts,
Right.
especially with positions and everything." So, what's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I've thought even last year that when he came back, he would see some minutes as a stretch five. As a matter of fact, the day, uh, yeah, the day before Kenny Atkinson was let go, parted ways with the team, I talked with him for a while alone about his plans to use Kevin Durant as a stretch five. And Jacques was, of course, part of that planning. But yeah, they planned to use him, not necessarily start him, but to use him to take advantage of matchups as a stretch five. Uh, Jacques, as far as I know, kept those plans, when he was in the bubble, and hopefully hoping to get this job. And Steve Nash has reiterated that he's got the same plans to sprinkle him in and to use him as a hammer when he has an opportunity, and as a matchup, to use him as a stretch five. I mean, the Nets have the capacity to put five guys on the court that can all shoot, give or take approaching 40% from three. You know, and they can do that with Kevin Durant as a 4, and they can do that if they put Jeff Green as a 5, and he plays the way he did in that short spell under D'Antoni in Houston. So I think they'll find opportunities to use him at stretch. I don't know that it'll be every game, and I don't know that it'll be massive minutes when he does, but I do think they can be impactful to turn a game when they need to.
Yeah. And before you mentioned Bruce Brown, were you kind of surprised of how that trade went down? Because, we got Shamet as well from that, and then Musa went to the Pistons, and Kennard went to the Clippers. But was any of that like kind of surprising of how the Pistons really gave up, young talent that probably have a higher ceiling than maybe the common fan may know?
Well, I mean, I think it probably makes sense from both teams' perspectives. I think the Pistons, well, the Pistons probably had more need for offensive help than they did defensive help. And they're looking at a guy who's still young in Musa, who isn't without talent. And you look and say, okay, he's young. He's under contract, all right, for another year out. Maybe he can develop into something offensively and pop. Whereas the Nets had need for a defensive player who didn't need a lot of shots and didn't need to be on the ball to be successful, and who was a little more seasoned. So I think from that perspective, it probably made sense for both parties. Those are win now moves. You're looking and you're saying these guys are going to be able to contribute, in all likelihood, more immediately than that draft pick would have contributed, or that Musa would have contributed. Musa's probably one of the few draft disappointments that I can say that they had. Now, that isn't to say that he can't succeed. Musa's got unswerving confidence in his abilities.
Yeah.
And he's the kind of guy, who knows, 5 years from now, you'll look up and when the Nets are playing him, he'll have a, poster of Sean on the wall throwing darts at it, and he'll give him 20. He's that kind of confident guy. But the Nets were in a position where they needed players who could contribute now to a playoff team.
Yeah.
And that's what they got. So I think it works out for everybody.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Musa, as you mentioned, the confidence, Chris covered him along Long Island, and he was, doing everything he needed to do. But fortunately, that experience doesn't always cleanly translate to the NBA. And if you don't get that NBA reps as much, even within, limited action in the bubble, it's not fair to his development. So hopefully, as you mentioned, he's very young. So wishing him all the best in Detroit.
Mm-hmm. And then, Bob, as you were talking about win now players kind of in that win now mode, they got Shamet, right? So playoff experience and everything. So what do you think about Shamet? What do you think his role will be? And just overall thoughts on just the acquisition of getting Shamet?
Well, I mean, Shamet's a guy, I don't have it in front of me, but I think he's played, 19 playoff games?
Mm-hmm.
He's played a good amount.
Yeah, 19.
Yeah. So, yeah, granted, maybe his sophomore season wasn't quite as impactful or as efficient as his rookie season. But here's a guy who, again, can shoot. You can expect him to shoot about 40% from three with upside. And that's coming off of your bench. So now when Joe Harris is either resting, injured, although he doesn't really get hurt a lot, but when he's injured or being rested for a game or just has to come out of the game to sit or is in foul trouble, what have you, you can still have him out there either as part of your second unit or when Joe is out, part of your first unit, and you don't have a precipitous drop-off in shooting. Is he Joe? Not yet. But then again, neither was Joe when he was that age. So he gives you a reliable three-point shooter, a little bit more of an off guard than a three, but a reliable three-point shooter behind Joe coming off your bench. Maybe not positionally, but the same skill, the same attribute that he's bringing to the game.
Yeah. Yeah, no, hopefully there'll be a lot of raining coming from deep this season. So switching to Uncle Green, Uncle Jeff Green. So what do you think about that pickup? He's played with Kevin Durant in Seattle,
Yes.
long proven career. So what do you think about him and his fit and, just him as an overall addition to the team?
Well, there was a time when you looked and you said, well, who could be a decent fit or who could be a likely acquisition for the Nets? And you would look at their agents, right? And you'd say, okay, who does this agent have, or who's with this agency? Now you look, you say, who could be a decent acquisition or who might be a likely acquisition? And you look, well, who's got really good relationships with Kevin? And that's what you look at. Now, I don't want to minimize him and pretend that, well, that's the only reason he's here. He fits a need and he makes them more versatile. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the center spot. If you had a stretch five, or even a stretch four that was giving them fits, or a guy who was really mobile and asked you to switch on the perimeter, that was an issue for the Nets. Jeff Green is capable of doing that. So I don't know. I couldn't tell you how many minutes he'll play because it probably is going to vary greatly night to night, depending on who they're facing. But he makes you more versatile. And again, it's rare that you see a guy at whatever, 33 have a career renaissance offensively at that age. But when you look at what he did in Houston playing for Mike, that's the best he's played in his career offensively. That's the most effective he's been on that end of the court. So, considering this is a guy who's his offensive coordinator, and now he will get opportunities playing with a loaded roster like this, I think the Nets feel and he feels that this could be a good marriage.
Yeah, definitely. There's going to be a lot of pick and pop action, and I think that will be hopefully one of the primary offenses they run. Anyway, so back to more shooting. Joe Harris is back, Tyler Johnson is back, both on new deals. So first off, how do you feel about these guys coming to Brooklyn, especially Joe Harris, who, he was part of the Sean Marks, I guess you can call it renaissance or new era of Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Sure. Well, happy for Joe. Uh, I guess the number probably caught a few people by surprise, but here's the thing. This is the new NBA. So there was a time when big men got overpaid. Now shooters get overpaid. That's the way it is. So when you accept that and you realize that, is it really an overpay? If you can stroke, you're going to get paid. And he has been as good as any. So I would see why he would get that money. As far as Tyler, listen, Tyler's a skilled offensive player. He's really smooth on the ball. I don't think that's even in question. With him, it's probably more the other end of the court. Again, I don't have it in front of me, but I think he might have been maybe a minus 73 or thereabouts in Orlando, which was the worst on the team. And he was still effective offensively, and he was a minus 7. That's where he has to improve. I'm not saying he's incapable of improving. I'm just saying that end of the court is where he has to shore it up. If he can shore that up, he's a real plus for this team because his offense will take care of itself. He's smooth offensively.
Yeah, no, he's a spark plug.
That end.
Yeah, no, he's a spark plug. He's a gritty guy, which kind of like Joe when it comes to defense, it's not about their ability to clamp down on players. It's about kind of that movement and action.
Right.
And Tyler Johnson, unfortunately, his face shows what kind of defense he plays. He's like a hockey player. So.
For sure. And then, Brian, let's look ahead at the big picture, right? So, obviously, a lot of lingering questions. We're playing during a pandemic. That's what it all comes down to as well. But with the roster the Nets have as it is, what are the expectations, and where do you think they'll end up?
It's hard for me to say because you'd have to tell me how many games am I getting from KD and Kyrie before I tell you where they're ending up.
Fair enough.
Last year, and what we expected to be a full season, I said, listen, if you get 120 games out of KD, Kyrie, and Karras. 3 of them run to the bank with that. If you get 100, that's okay. That's probably likely. You see, we didn't get close to that. Unfortunately, we didn't get close to that. And that was not even expecting KD to play. I was saying if you're getting 70 from one or 60 from one and 40 from another, between Karras and Kyrie, and you didn't even get that. So I don't know. I don't know how many games I'm going to get from KD and from Kyrie. What I would say is they have enough talent that I guess I could see them being second in the East record-wise, behind Milwaukee, which I still expect Milwaukee to have another great regular season record. And then the playoffs, I think, are really a more accurate depiction. I don't think where they finish in the regular season is all that vital. I think it's about what they do in the playoffs because that's the ultimate goal. I could see them losing in an Eastern Conference final this year, and then I could see them being better than that next year. I'm also giving you this, assuming that there's nothing catastrophic with KD or Kyrie, knock on wood, and I'm also giving you that, assuming that James Harden ends up elsewhere.
That's very fair. And one thing you brought up,
or that's Milwaukee or Miami or whatever. So I'm assuming that this is the roster that they have, and that this roster does not implode through either severe injury or rampant COVID tests. And hit with COVID more than anybody else in the NBA. So again, you can't discount that. But assuming that untoward happens, that's what I would say.
Now, Brian, I got to ask you too: is when you have a player to watch, right? I'll kind of leave the ball in your court for this one. Who's a player that a lot of people should kind of keep an eye on outside of the superstars?
On this roster or in the NBA as a whole?
This current roster.
On the Nets roster, not the NBA. Well, I mean, it kind of feels like I'm cheating because I say this every year. It's Karras. Every year I say this. To the point where, I mean, he's not a kid anymore. But if Karras stays healthy, I mean, comparatively healthy. I'm not saying all 72 games, but comparatively healthy, and gets to play large stretches with those two guys, and on the occasions that one of them is resting, is the number 2 option, I think he could be a monster. I think he could be really good. Now, I don't know how much stock you put in the various, top 100 ratings, whether they're from ESPN or 2K. But I mean, he's a guy who I think, if he actually stayed healthy and stayed on the court, could take a big jump up those rankings by the end of this season.
Yeah, I think another big question of that is his shooting percentage from deep, which I think also applies to Spencer as well. Those are the two biggest things I need to look out for those particular two players.
Right. I think Karras is a weird one in that, very few guys do I see where their catch and shoot numbers are way worse. That's not normal. I mean, usually that's, you're going to shoot off the bounce is a harder shot than somebody setting you up for a catch and shoot. And Karras, at least last year, I think the last time his catch and shoot numbers were better might have been, 2 or 3 years ago. I don't remember. But if he can improve on that, because his shooting off the bounce actually wasn't that bad. It was actually better. But if he can improve his catch and shoot numbers from deep, I think you've got a really, really nice third option.
Yeah, especially, playing alongside Kevin and Kyrie, you're going to be open quite a bit.
Yeah.
And as I've joked a lot, people asked who would get the last shot if the Nets traded for James Harden. I said Joe Harris. He would
Yeah.
always
Well,
be open. He
yeah.
would get that Danny Green option every time.
Be wide open, and he'll make them like 50% of the time, 55 wide open. Yeah.
Yeah, people are saying between 50 to 60 if that was the
Yeah.
case. But one more question before I ask the big fuzzy one.
Mm.
Um, so you mentioned playoffs. Do you think, at least for the playoff, would they go back to a bubble, including the play-in games?
Right. I don't know. Um, it's difficult for me to speak for the NBA, and I don't know. If they did, I mean, it was as safe a place as there was in America. I mean, they did a fantastic job with that bubble. The cost of being inside it was not insignificant. I mean, what, $60,000 or thereabouts probably. So it's not insignificant. But I think they'd be open to anything that they had to do to protect their playoffs when they see how much is at stake there. So not trying to speak for Mr. Silver, but yeah, I think they would be open to it. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And we've mentioned him a few times, James Harden. So first off, do you expect him to get traded this season by the deadline?
Probably.
And if so, where do you rank your top three? It doesn't have to be in order, but the 3 places you think he'll land.
Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and I guess I'm going to say Milwaukee.
Yeah, I would say it's a coin flip between Milwaukee and Miami.
I mean, Miami makes sense in some ways. It's just I'm trying to picture James Harden playing under a Riley regime, and
yeah, the tolerance of going to the club will be a lot different.
Yeah, I don't know. And there's a lot of temptation in Miami, a lot of ways for him to run afoul.
Nightlife, as the New York, as playing in New York, the home field advantage was New York City nightlife always wins. But I guess that same is what you're alluding to, Miami as well.
Right. So if I had to put 3 in no particular order, yeah, I would say reuniting with KD in Brooklyn, reuniting with Morey in Philly, or Miami, or Milwaukee.
Squashing of being that over dribbler.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, I got one more question before we let you go. So preseason's right around the corner, Sunday. What's your expectations? You think they, as Nash has said, been as competitive as we could be? Do you think they're going to take that route? Do you think they're mostly going to, with the rotations, do you think they're just going to throw a lot of pieces out there? There's going to be a lot of subs. What's your overall thoughts and expectations heading into those 2 preseason games?
I think there'll probably be very liberal use of subs. Mm-hmm. I don't think we'll be able. I mean, listen, some guys are obviously going to play. Mm-hmm. Their spots in the rotation are safe, and you have other guys where you can safely assume they will be out of the rotation. But I think they will treat KD and Kyrie with kid gloves anyway in the whole preseason. And I think they will sub very liberally through both of those games. And even the first several games of the regular season as they try to figure out who meshes well with who fits well with who. I think that'll be more important than, trying to build up guys' endurance immediately and putting a lot of minutes on them early. I think seeing a lot of different combinations is probably going to be on order of the day through the early parts, through the preseason, through the early parts of the regular season.
Yeah, definitely. Do you anticipate our 2 main stars to play close to 20 minutes, maybe? Or to even play both games?
I'm sorry, what was the second part?
The other would, do you anticipate them to play both games?
I don't know if they'll both play both games, but yeah, 20 might be reasonable. Yeah, 20 might be reasonable.
That's what I'm thinking, somewhere along that. But Brian, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate taking some time every day to join Doug and I. And floor is yours. Where can our viewers and listeners find you?
Oh, well, obviously, they can find me in the post. They can pick up the post and buy it, or nypost.com, or they can follow me on Twitter, which would be nypost_Lewis, Lewis. Any of
Perfect.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Best to you and your family. Stay safe and look forward to more of your content this upcoming season. And thank you again so much.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Chris, time to give closing remarks, and we'll see each other later.
Yeah, so guys, remember to send over any suggestions, questions, comments, or thoughts on any of our content by sending an email to wingspanpodcast@gmail.com. And do not forget to follow us on social media. But most importantly, make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your preferred listening service. And as for next time, stay classy, take care, and wear a mask.